Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of Text Appeal Lessons on the Body, Mind, and Beyond. This will be a continuation of the previous episode, and I will immediately be picking up on the topic of emotions. And I will now frame emotions as that which motivates or inhibits, generally in the name of fitness. In evolution, fitness is about success at survival and reproduction, not about exercise and strength. This episode also focuses on addiction, emotions in general, and reevaluating our relationship to pleasurable substances and activities. I hope you gained something from this, and doing the research for this really allowed me to reevaluate my own relationship to certain substances and activities, really examine my routines, and made me think about what I need to change. So, thank you for listening. Here we go. Now, remember the dual process model and the conversation between the archaic parts of your brain and the newly evolved neocortex? Good, because we are returning to this concept. In class this past semester, I learned that the brain structures in the limbic system mature much more quickly than the neocortex in normative brain development. This is not to say that these structures are fully mature during adolescence. However, they are farther along the process than the brain regions associated with what is called higher order cognitive functions. This basic fact is why it is quite often the case that we can more easily forgive a teenager for their impulsivity and emotional outbursts by simply labeling them as angsty hormonal teens. Hormones are another piece of the puzzle, which are very involved in emotions and emotional regulation that will be elaborated on at a different time. The phylogenetically older brain systems are more developed during adolescence, and the surge of hormones that come with puberty all contribute to the classic emotional teenager. A simple way of understanding this is like comparing a teenager to a car that is all gas and no brakes. Or more accurately, the teenager is going to be more sensitive to going full throttle and less likely to use the brakes before it's too late. If only I could go back in time and use my brakes a little more often just a couple years ago. But you come to realize that there are good outcomes for making mistakes, and improving in your next endeavor really is possible, and that's just the nature of a human life. So, now that we have returned to the analogy of gas and brakes for the way we process information and make decisions, I want to apply this to punishment and reward. We all intuitively understand that when training a dog or even parenting a child, we punish them or reward them in hopes that their behavior is shaped by these methods. Let's dissect punishment and reward and their connection to our emotional experience. A punishment is the infliction of a negative experience onto another being, usually for the purpose of deterring an action. When the child throws a tantrum, they are put in timeout, or a toy may be taken from them. This works because the brain is very much a learning machine, and the nervous system becomes adapted to our experiences so that we may avoid undesirable outcomes. Assuming that the child had an attachment to the toy, and this toy brought forth a positive experience to the child, taking the toy away is less about the toy itself and more about the experience of playing with the toy, or maybe even the security of having the toy as a potential future experience. It is also important to recognize the territorial nature of organisms, as the toy is a possession, and possessions are sort of like an extension of ourselves. People can become terribly upset when their property is damaged, and the same neural circuitry that produces anger, sadness, and other forms of psychophysiological stress when someone is physically abused become active when one's property is damaged. A reward has a similar nature, as we can reinforce a behavior that we find appropriate in a child by giving them something that they will experience, such as buying them a new toy or giving them a food they like. Punishment and reward can be positive or negative, not to be confused with good or bad. Positive punishment is when we add something to the experience of the organism that is undesirable or discomforting, while negative punishment is when we take something away that was otherwise producing a pleasurable outcome. Positive reward is when a reward is given in order to reinforce a behavior, and negative reward is when an unfavorable item or experience is removed so that the organism may have a better experience. In broader evolutionary terms, we are fundamentally wired to avoid threats and to maximize opportunities. Threats might be predation, inclement weather conditions, and the possibility of getting food and water taken by another party. Opportunities are fundamentally associated with food and sex. Take a moment to analyze why it is important to be intelligent, informed, attractive, physically fit, and socially capable. Intelligence signals to possible mates and other people around you that you are a competent individual that can provide resources to the team and to yourself. Information is the most valuable currency in the universe, as all human inventions are a result of creative ways of using information. Think of the old saying, give a man a fish and he can eat for a day, teach a man to fish and he can eat for a lifetime. It is more important to know where the food is and how to attain it than it is to have food right at this moment, as long as you are not on the verge of starvation. This directly relates to my point earlier. Having the meta-information about the nature of your decision-making is more valuable than making the right decision one time. Being attractive is obviously going to correlate with more opportunities for sexual and romantic relationships, and being physically fit is an observable indication of one's fitness. Being deemed competent in the social realm is also very important, as one human is only capable of so much, and establishing social connections means more opportunities for resources and information. Additionally, in the longest study on human happiness and well-being ever conducted by Harvard, it is evident that having no strong positive social relationships is terribly detrimental to one's health and well-being. Maybe you are more of an introvert and you prefer a quiet life, but this means that you are going to benefit from a few close relationships, while the extrovert gains energy from being a social butterfly. Even the most introverted personalities rely on other people. They just need less social interaction than the average person. Personalities themselves are the combination of your genetics and your many life experiences. There is no one-size-fits-all prescription for how many social relationships one should have, but it is almost never beneficial to spend long periods of time in complete solitude, especially if this is not a choice, and instead is a result of people not wanting to be around you, or maybe you dislike everyone else to the point of just wanting to be alone. Notice how even the most complicated human constructs are still fundamentally related to threat aversion and optimization of opportunities. Social status itself is correlated with so many social benefits, and we cannot blind ourselves to these simple truths. Of course, the entire system is not necessarily simple, but understanding that you are a primate with a somewhat articulated consciousness, always looking for the next opportunity, is extremely useful. This knowledge may be the very difference between a life well lived and an insufferable existence filled with bitter resentment for humanity and the world as a whole. You are rewarded and punished by your environment all of the time. People praise you when you do something they like, or if what you accomplish is admirable, maybe you're an inspiration to a person who deems you impressive. People will also quickly remind you of what is socially unacceptable by punishing you for some type of transgression against the social contract. Take, for example, something like sexual assault. When someone commits sexual assault, it is advantageous for others to become aware of this, as it allows the rest of the population to avoid and punish this person for their criminal behavior. The person is marked as a sexual offender and has to be registered with this title for the remainder of their life. And even if somehow they are removed from the system that tracks sexual offenders in the neighborhood, word of mouth will have surely spread, and the reputation of this person will surely affect their life in negative ways. This example is intense but useful. Let's take another example of someone who is maybe just a little too obsessed with themselves. Whenever they come around, people will bear the burden of watching them dramatize their own lives in a narcissistic and self-serving manner. And when these people leave the room, they will surely be talked about in a negative way, because we human beings are highly opinionated and find it very necessary to express our distaste for certain personalities which we find repugnant. Now, I can agree that gossip is kind of ugly, but when you take a step back, you may realize that gossip is actually very necessary in alerting other people about possible threats that may come as a result of interacting with certain people. Once again, this goes back to threat aversion and maximization of opportunities. You may have a bad gut feeling about someone who just began dating your friend, and System 1 is responsible for this intuitive processing of information about the person in question. You are reading their body language and maybe a past interaction with a similar person that you found to be bad news as a romantic partner, cues that this person is not worth investing much time into. Regardless of how you feel about any person, event, or possibility, recognize how your reactions are all based on emotional experiences. You are a system of systems, and in general, your entire existence is predicated on your survival, probably because you are mostly useless as a dead person. This system is not without flaws, however, and we can see that irrational fears, addiction, PTSD, OCD, and countless other psychological disorders are a result of pathological emotional responses. Emotions either move you towards something or inhibit your actions. Are you a car that is all gas, no brakes? And maybe this means a terrible accident is in your future. Or are you a car that doesn't have gas and you feel stuck in the parking lot while everyone else seems to be having a ball out there on the road? Next, I want to dive into dopamine and how it relates to all of this behavior talk. The dopaminergic reward system. What is dopamine? Dopamine has many functions, and I must admit, I haven't quite become a master of understanding the relationship between the brain and neurotransmitters such as dopamine and serotonin. I do, however, understand plenty about certain roles that these chemicals play in our brain and how they relate to well-being. Dopamine is often called the reward or motivation molecule, and this way of looking at it is decent in terms of a general understanding of it, but it's actually much more complicated than that. For example, dopamine is related to a number of functions, such as movement or motor control, and a disorder of dopamine can result in Parkinson's disease. Dopamine also has much to do with sleep, libido, and of course, addiction. I will focus on the nature of addiction and habit formation for now. The dopaminergic system is extremely important for the attainment of goals and the reinforcement of behavior. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, which means it is a chemical messenger that acts on neurons. Dopamine is also a neuromodulator, which is a subset of neurotransmitters that alter the activity of neurons and also alter the way in which your neurons communicate with each other. Neurotransmitters live inside of the neuron and are released from what is called the synaptic vesicle. A synapse is the gap between two neurons that are communicating through electrical signals with one another. Basically, all you need to understand is that chemically, there are substances that live within your neurons, which are released for various reasons. And this chemical signal then becomes an electrical signal, and the electrical signal results in the activation of different neurons, which then produces different levels of brain activity. So, for example, we can stimulate different parts of a rat's brain with some electrical nodes, and this stimulation creates a response in the brain of the subject. Neurotransmitters affect brain activity in a similar way, and something like sugar, which reliably activates your dopaminergic reward system, is a perfect example for understanding the role of dopamine as a human being. When sugar is eaten, dopamine is released in the brain. These heightened levels of dopamine result in feelings of satisfaction and pleasure. The pleasurable experience reinforces the likelihood that you will seek out more sugar in the future, whether it's grabbing another cookie now or ordering dessert at dinner tomorrow night. Over time, as you consume sugar more and more frequently, you develop a tolerance to the substance. This is when it takes more of the same substance to achieve the same pleasurable effect. This leads to overconsumption of sugar, ultimately resulting in higher likelihood of obesity, diabetes, and overall deficits of dopamine, which means your ability to have pleasurable experiences is dampened in a way. Low dopamine levels can lead to feelings of fatigue or depression, potentially driving a person to consume more sugar to regain those pleasurable feelings, creating a cycle of dependence. This might sound intuitively obvious and familiar, but understanding your relationship to pleasurable activities is super important for your long-term well-being. And an analysis of your own habits is, in my opinion, very necessary. And I even recommend taking stock of your addictions something like once a month. I have an addiction to caffeine, and until I get coffee in the morning, I feel more irritable, less motivated, and it's almost like a voice is coercing me into getting my fix. Come on, Travis. You know you'll be better once you get the coffee. You know this transcript will get done faster, and you have been drinking coffee for the past 90 days. What could it possibly hurt? The formation of habits is not something we can easily escape, as evolutionary psychology makes a strong case for the utility of creating and establishing routines. Once again, you are a learning machine, and most of the learning in your life occurs at a subconscious level, where you can become easily blinded to the patterns of behavior that make up your life. So, this is your wake-up call, and it might be painful to evaluate your own addictions, but trust me, the terrible pain of withdrawal now and the discomfort experienced in the absence of your addictive substance is worthwhile, and that craving will slowly but surely subside. Funny enough, I just took a quick break from writing to brew my second cup for the day, and it is almost ironic to be feeding my own addiction while talking about the potential danger of it. My advice here is not to try and completely avoid forming habits or even addictions, but instead, dissect your relationships to substances and other pleasurable activities that you often partake in, and ask yourself, is this addiction going to negatively affect my health in any serious manner? Does this addiction pathologically affect my mood to the point that people around me have expressed concern and or a negative reaction to who I am becoming? How do I feel about my dependence on an external substance? And what does my particular addiction tell me about how I cope with trauma and existential dread in general? I once heard on a podcast that addictions are sort of like a monster that you feed, and that becomes more powerful as you engage with it. But the monster itself can find satisfaction from other sources and substances, meaning that if you have already formed an addiction, there is a possibility that you can direct the addictive patterns to feed on more positive forms of pleasure. Some examples that I and many others have found to be positive addictions, so to speak, are addictions to exercise, reading, writing, cold plunges, a fulfilling career, podcasts, and so much more. All of these activities can also become negative because if you are hyper oriented toward any of these activities, then you might actually find that you have no time to provide maintenance to your relationships. Or maybe you weigh the value of your life against how many books you can read, and if you fall short of your goal, self-loathing can become your next addiction. We are habit-forming creatures, and this is just part of our reality. Let's take a little bit of time to learn more about habit formation and the distinction between sustainable habits and destructive ones. James Clear has a popular book titled Atomic Habits, and upon reading this book at age 17, I began understanding how similar we are to other animals from a behavioral standpoint. I highly recommend reading this book as it will open your eyes to the nature of forming habits, and he also provides a comprehensive framework on how to form good ones and break bad ones. He speaks about a concept deemed the habit loop. Clear describes the habit loop as consisting of 4 stages. Stage 1, the cue. This is the trigger that initiates the behavior. It can be an internal feeling or an external event, such as naturally becoming hungry because of fluctuating hormone levels, or maybe on TikTok, you saw a delicious looking cake that actually is the initial cause for the hormonal fluctuation. Stage 2, the craving. This is the desire or motivation to perform the behavior. The craving is driven by the expectation of a reward. This is the voice and feelings that provoke a response. The response is stage 3, and this is the actual behavior or action taken in response to the cue and the craving. This is eating the cake, inhaling the smoke, or drinking the alcohol. The 4th stage is the reward. The reward is the positive outcome or benefit received from the behavior, which reinforces the habit loop. This is the satisfactory feeling produced by higher levels of dopamine. This is the euphoric feelings produced when getting high, and this is the buzz from alcohol. James Clear then talks about the progression of habits and how they can become pathological in the form of addiction. There is the initial stage where a behavior starts with a cue that triggers a response. Then there's repetition, repeating the behavior in response to the cue and receiving a reward strengthens the habit. Lastly, we have automaticity. Over time, with sufficient repetition, the behavior becomes more and more automatic, which means it requires less conscious thought. When this automaticity reaches a point of compulsion, an individual may begin derailing their entire life in the pursuit of satisfying the addiction. This is the kind of creature you are, and your tendency to form habits is not as much about how good of a person you are, but it is more the result of your past experiences and your genetic predisposition toward forming addictions in the first place. For example, I love caffeine, and I certainly don't mind having a beer with some friends, but nicotine has never been enjoyable enough for me to form the habit. I have tried pouches, and I even smoked a cigarette once upon a time, but the buzz itself simply does not appeal to me in a way that has resulted in habit formation. We all have different sensitivities to the pleasurable feelings gained when using certain substances, and this is related to personality and brain chemistry more than we think. It is quite easy to accuse people of having a lack of discipline, and the individual can completely destroy their own sense of self-worth when evaluating their own life. I'm here to tell you that our tendency to think less of people who display impulsive or even addictive behaviors to certain activities or substances is natural, necessary, but also totally uninformed. In no way should we adopt a victim mentality where we can blame others such as our parents, friends, and other possible negative influences for everything wrong with our life. This type of living only results in more bitterness, resentment, and strips you of any power over your own life. However, within the last year, I have been convinced that most, if not all, human behavior is actually predicated on determined forces, and really, my hope for you all is to come to a similar conclusion, because recognizing the invisible forces that control your life is the only way you can ever step in and make drastic changes to yourself for the better. I will return to the famous free will versus determinism argument at a later time, but for now, open yourself to some compassion for yourself and others, because addictions to drugs, food, sex, and countless other pleasures is no laughing matter. Initially, smoking some weed, drinking some alcohol, and engaging in a one-night stand is quite harmless. However, if the pattern becomes compulsive, then problems, and I mean real problems, start to pop up. And it's best to understand how these addictions form, sustain, subside, and transform, so that you don't accidentally ruin your whole life for an external substance that isn't even essential for your survival. Now, let's talk about the continuous cycle of aim, chase, satisfaction, dissatisfaction, and repetition when it comes to so many aspects of your life. Can't you see that even though you were terribly hungry before dinner and then completely satisfied upon eating 3 plates, that you are going to experience this cycle pretty much every day of your life until you die? This is not exclusive to food, and it actually appears in pretty much every domain of life, because being alive is no different than tending to your body and mind in a sufficient manner that keeps you alive. That drug is reliably going to induce a pretty fun time, but you already know that the good feelings go away, and the bad ones are coming back even harder. You already know that getting the promotion at work is really only going to give you that satisfaction and triumphant feeling for a relatively short period of time. Even the most impressive and legendary moments in history, where people must have reached the peak of happiness and fulfillment, was surely followed by a reality check somewhere down the line, where no matter who you are and what you've done, your experience and how you feel at any time is related to your mental and physical state in that particular instance. You already know that there is nothing you can do as a human that will leave you in a permanent state of fulfillment. And this is not something we should just brush off as it is what it is. You are constantly setting goals at the micro and macro level, and I guarantee that your own sense of achievement and value as a human is tied to your ability to set goals and follow through with a plan to score that goal. So keep aiming upward and chase those big dreams, but also don't forget to look around every once in a while and admire a beautiful tree or something. There are 2 main ways to look at the following statement I'm going to make. I'd like you to figure out which one you agree with and ask yourself if that is the way you want to see your life. The statement is, we're all going to die anyway, so who cares? How did you read that? Were you motivated to take that risk, to ask that guy or girl out, and to speak your mind about that topic you are so passionate about, but you have never had the courage to speak up? Or did you hear that statement and infer meaninglessness, where you instead say, what's the point of going on another day? Because we're all going to die, and my existence is a tragedy. Life is pain, and for what? Just so I can move through life like a zombie, and really, I see no chance for improvement. These very different reactions are common, and at the surface level, illustrate the basic difference between the pessimist and the optimist. Don't worry, there isn't a right answer. Don't worry, there isn't a right answer. And I have followed the second thought pattern down a pretty terrifying rabbit hole, and I don't like where that one ends. You are not alone, my friend, as the tragedy of existence is quite real, but I promise you, there are alternative perspectives, and do not be afraid of loving yourself enough so that you can see through those more positive lenses. Lastly, I ask you to protect your own body's capacity to produce pleasurable experiences, because past a certain point, there really is no return. Drug addiction can lead to the complete destruction of your ability to not only have good experiences, but can even leave you in a permanent state of feeling like something is missing, where you don't even ever just feel okay. The next episode will pick up with a discussion about homeostasis, allostasis, and the concept of entropy in relation to what a human being is in a more philosophical way. I hope to help you frame your existence in a way that you can see yourself as a beautifully designed creature with some pretty complicated issues to solve. I will be talking about how the world is literally and metaphorically always falling apart, and why it is important to continually put it back together. There will also be a section dedicated to understanding and addressing the problem of dissatisfaction creeping back into your life, no matter what you accomplish or what material wealth you acquire. If you made it this far, you are either a total nerd like me, or maybe these topics actually speak to you. Either way, I am grateful to have provided you with some information about yourself, and I hope it serves you well. So thank you for listening to episode 3 of Text Appeal, Lessons on the Body, Mind, and Beyond.